Today on Fear and Greed, Richard White steps down as CEO of Wisetech Global after a series of allegations about his personal life. China accuses Australia of systemic racism and hate crimes, and the big banks split over lending rules. All this plus plenty of market news. Welcome to Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. It's Friday, the 25th of October, 2024. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, the main story this morning, the founder and CEO of Wisetech Global, Richard White, has resigned effective immediately after 2 weeks of revelations about his personal life and a 30% drop in the company's share price.
In a statement last night, Mr. White said it has been a challenging time for him, his family and friends, and he remains committed to the company. He founded Wisetech Global 30 years ago. He's been running it for that long. Of course, this follows a series of allegations over the past 10 days or so. It started in a legal dispute with Sydney wellness entrepreneur Linda Rogan. She claims that Mr. White agreed to help fund her business, but expected sexual favours in return. That lawsuit was settled. There are also allegations that he approached female entrepreneurs on social media with offers of professional support that could later shift to crude or suggestive language. Nine Media reported that Mr. White had a lengthy relationship with an employee named Christine Contos. Ms. Contos was recruited by Mr. White after the start of their relationship back in 2016. He gave her a luxury waterfront mansion worth $7 million in Melbourne's Docklands at the end of the relationship, according to Nine. In fact, there were 3 properties that have emerged over the past couple of weeks that were purchased by Mr. White that were allegedly given to women that he had relationships with. Also, Nine yesterday alleged that a former director of Wisetech Global, who left the business in 2019, accused Mr. White of intimidation, bullying, and overseeing poor corporate governance. Ultimately, that's why she left the business. So you can imagine with all that swirling around, and they are allegations, that Mr. White decided to step down.
Why do you think he went in the end? Do you reckon this was a personal decision, or was he forced out?
We're never going to know that. Ahead of the announcement yesterday, which came after the market closed, Wisetech Global's share price hit a 2-month low, falling below $100 a share. Now it's down almost 30%. It's 29% over the past couple of weeks on the backs of all these allegations. There would have been intense personal pressure on him, though he has run this business for 30 years. Obviously, it's his baby. I would imagine there would be enormous pressure from big investors, super funds, who do not like companies involved in this type of stuff. Also, some of the industry bodies had suggested that Mr. White would no longer be representing them, so that would put pressure on him. Don't know whether he was forced or personal, but there was just so much going on that it was probably inevitable that he did step down.
Yeah, it did seem that way. There was just so much coverage and so many new revelations and allegations coming out that it did have that slightly inevitable feel to it. Now, Sean, moving on, China has accused Australia of systemic racism and hate crimes, as well as hypocrisy, after an Australian diplomat raised concerns about human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Tibet.
Yeah, so China's foreign ministry spokesperson denounced Australia for criticising China publicly. That occurred in the United Nations forum earlier in the week. The spokesperson said, and I quote, "Out of their ideological bias, Australia, the US and a handful of other Western countries stoked confrontation at multilateral platforms for their selfish political interest." He went on to say about Australia specifically, "Australia, long plagued by systemic racism and hate crimes, have severely violated the rights of refugees and immigrants and left Indigenous people with vulnerable living conditions." Michael, there was more. And I quote, "Australian soldiers have committed abhorrent crimes in Afghanistan and other countries during their military operations overseas. These Western countries turn a blind eye to their severe human rights issues at home, but in the meantime, point their fingers at other countries. This says a lot about their hypocrisy on human rights."
Sean, we were just talking about China earlier in the week and the amount of wine that's being exported to China. This feels like a really sharp shift, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea that we're going through a period of stabilisation, which is a phrase that the Albanese government uses, probably hides the fact that underneath the surface, there are still real tensions. Things improved when Anthony Albanese became Prime Minister. And of course, under the Morrison government, there were about, exports worth $20 billion worth of exports were hit with tariffs. They've slowly been reduced. And I think they're pretty much all, I think it's about $500 million left of tariffs. We had the story earlier in the week about wine exports doing so well. So, yes, I mean, it is sort of a sharp turnaround, but I think underneath the surface, there's always been this issue bubbling along. For his part, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese yesterday said Australia's been clear and consistent with China over its concerns about human rights abuses.
Okay, big start to the show. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is in Samoa for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. CHOGM. It's a terrible acronym, isn't it? And said acknowledging climate change is the entry fee for credibility.
You know, I didn't think we were still arguing about climate change. I thought we all agreed that it was real.
It did feel like the science had been settled on that one.
Yeah. I mean, obviously climate change is front and centre at any CHOGM meeting, particularly in the Pacific, because countries like Tuvalu and Kiribati are actually at real threat from climate change, of not existing. So I'm sure that'll be front and centre. What will be interesting, or among the many interesting things at CHOGM, Michael, is that the Prime Minister will meet for the first time the new British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. They're likely to talk about climate change, energy policy, and, of course, AUKUS. Penny Wong's also over there. Just of note, yesterday she said that it's of grave concern the reports that North Korea is aiding Russia by sending troops to help in the fight against Ukraine.
Yeah, they're quite sinister photos. If you see those kind of circulating online of the Russian flag and the North Korean flag side by side.
Yeah.
And it does just raise a few alarms, I would say. It does.
And at the moment, Xi Jinping is in Russia visiting Vladimir Putin. There is a grouping which used to be known as the BRICS countries, but that's sort of fallen apart, the BRICS countries. But there is still North Korea being one, Russia, China, who are gathering and trying to kind of come up with some multilateral organisation to work essentially against the US and its allies. So very, very tense times in terms of geopolitics at the moment.
Yeah, indeed. Now, back home, nuclear power in Australia, Sean, would take 15 years to develop, according to the head of the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency.
Gillian Hirth's estimate doesn't support the coalition's claims that nuclear power can be ready in Australia by 2037. Mind you, she did agree that the Atomic Energy Agency said that new entrants could take just 10 years, though she said she thought it was more like 15 years. Another fly in the ointment, which emerged yesterday, was the boss of the energy regulator. So Gillian Hirth is the Nuclear Safety Agency. Claire Savage is the energy regulator. She said that developing the regulatory framework for nuclear, if you're going to consult, and we are a democracy, there will be a consultation process, that'll take about 8 years. So that's 8 years plus 15 years, 23 years. That's a long time before we're going to get nuclear.
Just imagining what a fly in nuclear ointment would look like, Sean. I'm assuming it's got about 9 legs and half a dozen wings. Anyway, bit of a public service announcement here, Sean. If you're flying Qantas today, you better check that your flight is still scheduled because 600 engineers are expected to stop work throughout the day.
Qantas has its annual general meeting in Hobart. Now, this industrial action coincides with that. There are 2 sets of 4-hour stop works in Sydney, in Brisbane, in Hobart, and in Perth. Engineers are the guys that conduct the pre-flight safety checks, ground support, planners, simulators, that type of stuff. We like the engineers. We need them. They want a 25% pay rise over 3 years. Sounds a lot, but actually their wages have been frozen for almost 4 years now. So if you are flying Qantas, just check to make sure your flight's taking off.
How about this one, Sean? There's a stoush going on between the big banks at the moment, with Commonwealth Bank and Westpac supporting current guidelines around home lending, while NAB and the Australian Bankers Association want the rules eased.
A big bank stoush. Pretty good, isn't it?
Or what about a big bank Barney?
Oh, that'd be better. There's a Barney going on between the big banks, a big bank Barney.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about that serviceability buffer. We used to talk that in COVID days. We spoke a lot about that. It's now 3%. It's the amount a lender needs to be able to service when getting a loan. So if you're charged 7% for a home loan, that's your interest rate, the bank checks to make sure that you'd be able to repay the loan if you were charged 10%. 7 plus 3, 10%. And the argument is that 3% still relevant? It was introduced when interest rates were really, really low. And so what National Australia Bank and the Australian Bankers Association argue is that it should be reduced because interest rates are higher now. They're not going to go up by another 3%. Therefore, we don't need such a large serviceability buffer. That would help people like first home buyers. However, yesterday the Commonwealth Bank and Westpac came out and said it's prudent to keep that serviceability buffer. They said that the answer to the home loan crisis isn't to put more people into debt. Not often do you see the big banks disagreeing with each other on these sorts of policy issues.
Sean, there was plenty of corporate news around yesterday. We were spoiled for corporate news. Fortescue's share price fell 3.2% after quarterly production updates showed that tonnage of iron ore shipped was down during the September quarter compared to the June quarter.
Yeah, so that sent Fortescue's share price down. Elsewhere on the market, Newmont's share price tumbled 6.4% after a disappointing quarterly earnings report on Wall Street. Remember, Newmont bought Newcrest, and mostly that company is traded in the US nowadays, but it does own Newcrest's assets. HMC Capital halted its shares as it prepares to raise $300 million to put towards a near $2 billion acquisition of Sydney data centre owner Global Switch Australia. Data centres are all the rage. Brambles provided an underwhelming trading update. Its share price fell 2%. Reece Plumbing's share price fell 7.5% after it said the trading environment was challenging. It was the worst performer of the top 200. Better news for Furniture Group Adairs, which said sales were stronger in the past 16 weeks or so. That triggered a 12.5% jump in its share price by the end of the day. With all that going on, S&P ASX 200 did nothing, up slightly to 8,206 points.
Slight point of order here, Sean. Would we describe Adairs as a furniture group, or is it more of Manchester group? I mean, I know I'm splitting hairs because really,
no. I was going to say light furniture. Yeah.
All I know is that I regularly see Adairs charges on our credit card at home, and typically it coincides with either sheets or towels arriving on the doorstep. And so I'm just making that assumption from there that they are in fact a Manchester retailer.
Yeah, no, it's probably a better call. I'd say they're more Manchester than... Not a word we use enough anymore, Manchester, is it?
No, it feels like it's a little bit kind of gender specific.
Passé.
Yes.
Passé.
Yeah, also
well,
passé.
I grew up a while ago, and I worked at Woolworth's variety store in Orange, and we had a Manchester department there. It's the only reason I know the word, I think.
Have we never talked about where you worked when you were growing up in Orange? It feels like we've talked about everything else, but we've never explored this part of what it was like in 1930s Australia.
Can I tell you about an interview? Can I tell you about an interview I've got after the show?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, it's with Michael McCarthy from Moo. It's part of our series with Moo, who's a great supporter of our podcast. This time, we're talking about stock screeners. It's really interesting. It's strategies you can follow when investing. So in the interview with Michael, we talk about if you want a strategy that you're chasing high dividend stocks. If you want to be like Warren Buffett, there's a Warren Buffett strategy. If you want to chase undervalued bank stocks. What Moo do is use AI, artificial intelligence, to provide kind of guidelines and parameters for how you can follow those strategies. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it certainly is. It's coming up after the show. Sean, Super Retail held its AGM yesterday and provided a soft sales update, I'd say, sending its share price down 5.4%.
Yes, so Super Retail owns Supercheap Auto, Rebel, BCF and Macpac. It held its AGM yesterday in Brisbane. Basically said the outlook is fairly uncertain, or there's uncertainty about the outlook. What it does mean is there will be more discounts across the stores. Love a good discount at Rebel, got to tell you. Mind you, Super Retail has its own corporate governance challenges at the moment. ASIC is investigating treatment of two former high-profile executives turned whistleblowers at the company. It's also facing allegations concerning bullying and harassment and claims that the chief executive officer, Anthony Herity, was having an affair with the head of human resources. They're all ongoing, all allegations, but it has some corporate governance issues as well.
Turning to international news now, and Tesla's share price jumped 12% in after-hours trading after the electric vehicle group recorded a surprise jump in its September quarter profit.
Yes, so net income jumped 17%, helped by more electric vehicle sales and a higher profit margin. Elon Musk forecast a big jump in earnings next year. In fact, he said EV sales could grow 20 to 30% next year on the back of lower prices and a meaningful impact from lower interest rates. Most people finance an EV, and when you've got lower interest rates, it's cheaper. Tesla is easily the most valuable car maker in the world. It's worth about 1 trillion Aussie dollars. Mind you, its share price is about half of what it was 3 years ago.
Sean, I find this next story quite staggering. Nearly 25 million Americans, so that's nearly the population of Australia, have already cast their vote ahead of the presidential election, which isn't for another 10 days or so, Tuesday week.
11 days,
yeah. With record levels of early voting in some battleground states. These are the key ones to watch.
Yeah, so North Carolina and Georgia have had record postal voting, but the authorities over there said basically it's huge amounts of postal voting. I don't know which side that helps. The polls still have the candidates neck in neck. What has emerged in recent days is some of the things Kamala Harris, she keeps saying, I won't be another Joe Biden administration. It just seems that Joe Biden seems like a drag on Kamala Harris. Pennsylvania is definitely getting the most attention from both the Trump and Harris camp. Seems to be the most important state of all. At the moment, Harris has a very, very small lead, according to the New York Times, less than 1%. So obviously within the margin of error there.
One last story. This is interesting. In the US, there are growing concerns about the big supermarkets introducing surge pricing, which we'd all be very familiar with from Ubers when you try and get an Uber on a Friday or a Saturday night and suddenly the price shoots up kind of 1.8 times. Not bitter about anything there, Sean. Meaning that supermarket shoppers will find higher prices on different items at different times of the day.
Yeah, next level from what's going on here. No doubt about it. Politicians or Democratic politicians in the US claim that Kroger, which has 2,800 stores, use digital price tags that allow for dynamic pricing. They go further. The politicians claim that facial recognition technology could be considered in pricing decisions as well. This is according to a New York Times story. Now, Kroger said it's not happening. Walmart, which has 4,600 stores, said it also has the technology and is not using it for pricing. These, what they call electronic shelf labels, are definitely being deployed across the country. The thing is, though, that Kroger's explanation, I mean, it didn't kind of play that well. Basically, the politicians asked Kroger whether it would use the tags to raise prices when it sees it fit in order to maximise profit. Rather than saying no, Kroger came out and said the new price tags were, and I quote, designed to lower prices for more customers where it matters most. So rather than raising prices, they're kind of saying we might lower prices, but doesn't that mean that it could raise prices?
It certainly sounds
and I think
like
that's what's really got it going. Yeah, it's got it going. Really fascinating, though, like to have facial recognition. And I'm not saying these supermarkets are going to do it, but the potential is there. Have this facial recognition and say, this person always spends a lot of money. Let's charge them more.
Oh, that is extraordinary. And it actually feels like a bit of a slippery slope.
Yeah, totally. And I stress Kroger and Walmart said we're not doing it, right? But the politicians in the US are pushing
Amazing story. Up next is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. You're speaking today with Michael McCarthy from Moomoo. It is coming up in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It is Friday, the 25th of October, 2024. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, TikTok and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.